Hello, everyone. So, what we'll be doing in the next couple of episodes is we're going to be starting a new series on evolution. And this particular episode it's going to touch on kind of stuff to do with the philosophical aspects behind evolution and kind of the debate behind evolution. And before even going into like the fossil record or any of the genes or anatomy in general, which future episodes will cover that stuff extensively. In this particular episode, we're just going to be hitting on really kind of the things that justify a specific theory in science. This particular episode doesn't just pertain to evolution, and it could be applied consistently to any major theory in science, whether that be string theory or quantum mechanics or different models of quantum mechanics. And so really what we'll see is that when it comes to justification and the burden of proof, there are four common kind of pillars of reason, and we'll go through them like in detail and step by step. But those four include intuition, includes Occam's razor, which is the principle of parsimony or the principle of simplicity, as well as blanket possibilities and explanatory scope. And so these four kind of factors, they influence what's known as the burden of proof. And like I said, we'll go through these in detail. So I brought this overall diagram that attempts to show what really or where the discussion actually lies. So off the bat, when it comes to evolution, there's four possibilities that people adopt, right? So the first of which is that what's known as Luca, which is a least common ancestor. And the first, if you can see my mouse cursor, this figure is one opinion held in evolution, which is that there's no design, right? And so these variations and these differences and adaptations, they're all occurring naturally through unguided, blind physical processes. And what really makes this view unique is that they posit, if you can see the bottom of the tree, they posit there's only a single common ancestor. So there's only one life form or the simplistic kind of life form, and that gave rise to all these different species that we see around us today. And so again, it forms a tree of life where there's only one trunk and multiple different branches. Now, to juxtapose that, there is another view, and this is also quite common in evolutionary science, where again they're saying that there's no design, right? And so this implies that all these kind of adaptations and all these variations that we see in nature, they come from blind physical kind of forces. And what we see here is that there's no single common ancestry. So it's not a universal common ancestry. So in this case, Luca, the least universal common ancestor, does not exist in this case. There's no trunk. So it's not just one species that gives rise to everything that we see here, but it's multiple independent species that gave rise to multiple independent domains. So whether that be bacteria, eukarya, archaea, or specific life forms, the idea here is that it's multiple different ancestors and it's not simply a universal ancestor. Now, that was in regards to the y-axis. In regards to the x-axis, as you can see, is that there's two other competing views, right? So one is to do with design. So this view says that there was a common ancestor, right? And so there was one unique single species that gave rise to all of the other species that we see around us today, but it was done through some type of divine based model, right? And finally, the alternative hypothesis is again, it invokes design. So there is design, but the variation that we see around us today, it's not due to one common ancestor, but again, it's due to multiple independent common ancestors or convergent ancestors. So my particular stance today will be in regards to this sphere where I do believe that there's design and I do not believe that there is a single universal common ancestor. But it's important to note that that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So, especially as a theist, and I'm not going to go through all of the technical philosophy behind here, but theism is really compatible with almost every single one of these models. So that's really important. So like theism doesn't really negate any specific model on this page, but I would argue that in terms of philosophy and in terms of science, the best explanation was actually going to be this domain right here. But again, it's important to know that just because there is design, that doesn't necessarily imply that you're a theist. So, for example, Michael Behe, he's a very well-known design theorist. He actually adopts this view. So he is a Christian, but he adopts this view not because of his theological kind of biases, but purely because of what he views as irreducible complexity. And a lot of these things we will be going into in detail in further episodes. But it's important to know that just because you do believe in design or intelligent design, that doesn't necessitate that you are a theist. And likewise, just because you believe in no design and just because you believe in, let's just say, no specific tree of life, does not necessitate that you're an atheist. But at least for the course of this presentation, what we'll be assuming is that we're going to be assuming that we'll be assuming that this y-axis doesn't really exist. So we'll only be looking at it through the x-axis. Really, I'm going to be simplifying the debate, but I'm going to be showing just the juxtaposition between the camp that says there is no design and the camp that says there is design. But again, it doesn't need to be that way. This is just done just for a bit of simplicity. So evolution versus intelligent design. Again, I am getting ahead of myself, but as just a pure basis to start the discussion, evolution here is defined as the change in allele frequencies over time, which kind of leads to speciation and diversification. And intelligent design is defined as irreducible complex systems that could not have arisen due to chance or blind physical processes alone. And again, as I said before, there's no contradiction between these two positions. One can hold on to the notion of design through the mechanism of evolution. So just because you are an evolution advocate doesn't mean that you don't believe in design. And likewise, just because you believe in intelligent design doesn't mean that you believe in evolution. So these are not mutually exclusive categories. But again, just for the sake of this discussion, I am going to treat it as if they are mutually exclusive. So I'm going to treat it as if universal common ancestry is incompatible with the belief of design. Again, this is not necessarily the case, but I'm just going to be assuming that just for sake of simplicity. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, whenever it comes to really any kind of scientific discussion, there are four fundamental ways that kind of proponents could justify their positions of that given theory. And so those four include intuition, Occam's razor, blanket possibilities, and also fulfillment of specific predictions. And as a quick definition, intuition, it means these instinctive beliefs or like gut feelings about what seems true and what doesn't seem true. Occam's razor, that is basically preferring the simplistic explanation, which basically means the one that posits the fewer assumptions or fewer amount of entities. Blanket possibilities, that what that means is assuming that something is possible by default unless it's proven impossible. And lastly, fulfillment of specific predictions. And that's really just the practice of citing successful predictions of a theory as evidence for its truthfulness. And so we will examine these justifications and look for consistencies in how each of these is applied to both sides of the argument. And again, the argument is between evolution and design, but I'm repeating myself here. That's not necessarily always a mutually exclusive position. You could be an evolutionary advocate while believing in design, and likewise, you can also be a design advocate while believing in evolution. It's not necessarily contradictory beliefs, but just for the sake of discussion, I'm going to assume that these are contradictory positions. So, a very crucial aspect in regards to this debate is that we have to be consistent, right? And so you'll see a lot of this going on later on in the discussion, but a lot of the evidence that's often brought with regards to evolution is very inconsistent. And what I mean by that is that they're often cherry picking the kinds of the kinds of arguments that they use to justify their position. So really, we need constant epistemology. And what epistemology means here is the study of how we know things. And when it comes to justification and what counts as evidence, we have to make sure that we're being consistent in using that same standard for all the different arguments within our own belief system, as well as the opposing belief system. And the burden of proof often shifts when you're having these kinds of conversations because of how we're viewing justification. As we'll see something like intuition, if one group holds something to be more intuitive than another group, then the burden of proof will be on the one who rejects that natural intuition. And again, the goal is to apply the same criteria to both evolution and design arguments. So, starting with the first justification, one of the first factors of justification for any scientific theory is intuition. And again, I defined it as beliefs or feelings that we hold instinctively without step-by-step reasoning. So, common examples of this include things like killing someone without reason is wrong. And also something like a part of something cannot be greater than the whole. Something like if you cut a pizza into four slices and then recombine it, you intuitively know that you won't end up eating more pizza than what you started with. And so these are self-evident truths in the sense that they're so intuitively obvious that you don't really require experimentation or you don't require data to prove them. Now, this can be further dichotomized into universal intuitions and subjective intuitions. So, universal intuitions are intuitions that pretty much everyone shares. So, there's something like, regardless of where you are in the world, regardless of when you live in the world, you'd always hold on to these kind of beliefs. They're like logical truths. Now, to kind of in comparison, there are these subjective intuitions, and these subjective intuitions vary by culture and by time. Stuff like many people may feel intuitively strong, or they may feel intuitively immoral to view something like slavery or something like child marriage. And although that is, let's just say that's something that many people would agree intuitively, that's not something that's universally held. So that particular, whether it be child marriage or slavery, certain groups in certain time periods and certain cultures viewed those practices as moral or not necessarily as immoral. And so the point here is that when it comes to scientific theories, what we're looking for are universal intuitions. And so these universal intuitions are the intuitions that can have some evidentiary value, whereas these subjective ones, regardless of how strong you feel about these subjective intuitions, these can't be used as evidence primarily because not everyone agrees with those subjective intuitions. And so when it comes to the design debate or the evolution versus design debate, as you can imagine, intuition plays a huge role here. And so just off the get-go, many people find design within nature very evidently intuitive, right? And so a widespread intuition kind of that looks as if it's there throughout history and every single moment in life is that things around us, they seem designed. People naturally see purpose and order within living things. And this intuitive belief in design appears across pretty much every culture and every single era that we look at. And there is also psychological backing on this. So, developmental psychologist Dr. Kellyman, he did a conclusive study. It was one of the most commonly cited studies in psychology. And what they show is that children have these intuitive beliefs that make them seem as if they are intuitive kind of theists from a very young age. And again, this goes to show that this layer of intuition is very universal because it's applying to even children as well. So just to read his conclusion, he says, a review of recent cognitive developmental research reveals that by around age 5, children understand natural objects as not humanly caused and can reason about non-natural agents' mental states and demonstrate the capacity to view objects in terms of design. Finally, evidence from 6 to 10-year-olds suggests that children's assignment of purpose to nature relates to their ideas concerning intentional non-human causation. Together, these research findings suggest that children's explanatory approach may be accurately described as intuitive theism. So, again, the point here is that children naturally tend to believe things in nature as having purpose or being designed. And that goes to show once again that this layer of intuition is very universal in terms of where you're living, in terms of when you live, how old you are, etc. So the intuition that life is designed, it's in fact so strong that even those who personally reject design as an explanation, even they have a tendency to call these things designed, right? I have a quote here and it reads, we have a similar bias to attribute an agent when we see non-random structure. This is the impetus for the argument for design. The intuition that the design that is apparent in natural and biological world is evidence for a designer. In one poll, 42% of respondents said that human evolution or that humans and animals have existed in their present form since the beginning, again, suggesting that they were created in that form. And others believe that evolution occurred but was guided by God. In other words, a large portion of people intuitively feel that the living world is the product of some intelligent guidance or some kind of design blueprint. And so, whether or not you agree or disagree with this explanation, or whether or not you actually believe that there is design or not, what's uncontroversial is that people intuitively do believe in design. And it's a natural inference, even based on psychological research, that design or seeing design, the human mind can just automatically assume design. It's such a strong intuition that it's held by even those who kind of reject design as well. And this is going over more of those aspects. So even prominent evolutionary biologists and atheists, they admit that kind of living organisms give this appearance of design. One of the most well-known evolutionary biologists, Richard Dawkins, who really doesn't need an introduction, but he says biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Now, it's important because Richard Dawkins, he doesn't believe himself that there actually is design, but he notes that it certainly looks that way. And Francis Crick, the scientist who discovered the structure of DNA, he also says biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. And so, again, he acknowledges that it's quite easy to see design when studying life. And so he urges scientists to remind themselves that according to evolutionary theory, it's all really just an illusion. It's not actually designed. But again, what these admissions go to show is that this intuition of design is actually quite universal. Now, this again goes to sort of the same thing. We have a universal textbook on biology, and it says the use of teleology, which is basically purposeful, like goal-oriented language. He says the use of teleology remains widespread in biology. Even though organisms are natural entities, it has proven difficult to understand these self-organizing, self-nourishing entities without such language. The purpose of the heart seems to be to pump blood. The purpose of the lungs seem to be to breathe air, and so on. This teleological language used to be understood as a literal manner as the purposeful creation of God, but it continues to be used in contemporary biology without reference to God. So there has been some searching for more neutral descriptions. Talk of purposeful complexity in teleology has often been replaced by terms like adaptation, functional complexity, or teleology. So once again, this goes to show that this intuition of design is very evident. Now, if we are considering intuition as a justification for belief, how does that really affect burden of proof? Now, if design is an intuition, then default belief, which is basically that many people believe that life is designed, but that default belief seems to be quite widespread. And so, someone arguing against design, so for example, an evolutionist who say that life is not designed, they would have to carry the burden of proof. They would need to prove or provide evidence to overcome this natural intuitive disposition that we have so much design around us. Now, since nearly everyone starts with the intuition that life has a purpose in design, the onus is on the person who claims that all of this is really an accident of evolution. Now, we'll see much later on, but the question is, can you even prove that? Can you prove that it's actually an accident and not really design? We'll be touching on this in one of the future episodes, particularly the one with regards to the kind of logic behind universal common ancestry. But again, we will explore this topic of whether or not it's even possible to discredit design or whether or not that's just an axiom that's held philosophically before you even begin the experimentations. Now, with regards to intuition, evolutionists also use what's known as intuition. So they also reference their own positions or they use intuition to argue for their own positions as well. So this is quite important because when often when a design advocate goes and shows that there is design in the universe, they would respond by saying something like intuition shouldn't be really used as evidence in regards to scientific theories, because just because you feel that something is a particular way doesn't imply that it's actually that way. And so that's actually not a bad argument. It's a pretty good argument, right? But what we see on the flip side is that when it comes to their models, they don't mind using intuition. So again, this is one of the inconsistencies that I was talking about earlier on. When you read the literature and you go deep into the scientific discourse back and forth, that like scientists are quick to dismiss intuitions on design, but when it comes to their own explanations of universal common ancestry, on homology, on vestigial organs, and they're willing to invoke this notion of design, but again, they're not willing to be charitable and give the design advocates that same intuition. We'll be going over some of the arguments that evolutionists use that are based on design, right? One of those is the aspect that an intelligent designer wouldn't really include these useless features, what are known as pseudogenes or vestigial organs, which kind of have no functions anymore. And what they're saying is that this is proof against a design based blueprint because good designer wouldn't really waste DNA, right? They wouldn't really waste organs in the sense that why would a good designer produce these junk copies of DNA? Why would a designer or why would a good designer use junk kind of organs? So again, they're relying on what's known as intuition. And a notable atheist, his name is Kenneth Miller, he kind of says the same thing, right? So he says the human genome is littered with pseudogenes, gene fragments, orphaned genes, junk DNA, and so many repeated copies of pointless DNA sequences that it cannot be attributed to anything that resembles intelligent design. And this is also a common argument by atheists as well. And so they would say something like, if God designed everything and God is supposed to be all wise, why is it that we have suffering and pain receptors? So again, the idea here is that the intuition that designer would create a particular way that is based on, it's quite fundamental to the theory of evolution. So they would argue that things that kind of look as though they were a waste or they have no functions to them. And by the way, like we'll be exploring this topic a bit further in future discussions, whether or not junk DNA really is junk, whether or not the appendix or other vestigial organs are truly vestigial. So we'll be going over that in more detail. But even if we concede for the sake of argument, it's telling that they are, in fact, invoking intuition here. So again, goes over the same point that if you're willing to dismiss design for, or sorry, if you're willing to dismiss intuition for divine advocates, then you must be consistent and also apply that same standard to yourself. And once again, the reason why I'm going over this and why I'm spending so much time on this is because for anyone who's actually read the back and forth, or for anyone who's actually opened up the standard textbooks and saw the back and forth between divine advocates or design advocates and evolutionary advocates, you would see that the time and time again, these scientists are invoking their own intuitions and they have no issue with invoking their own intuitions. But when a design advocate is saying, look, like this is clearly designed, or like this is clearly a universal intuition, they are really dismissing that assumption. And they're saying that we shouldn't assume that things are the way they are just because we feel that way. So again, this goes to show that there is this kind of selective cherry picking nature that's going on in the discourse. Now, going on to the second form of justification, we have what's known as Occam's razor. Occam's razor, in kind of simple terms, it's the idea that the simplest explanation is usually the one with the more correct explanation or the best explanation. So, in practice, using Occam's razor means that if you have two competing explanations for the same phenomenon, you would generally pick the one that introduces the least complexity or the fewest kind of new elements that are being posited. So this principle is actually widely used in science and philosophy. It's actually the rule of thumb. And as we will see, how you define kind of simple here is quite tricky. People are often misuse Occam's razor just because they can't really define that term. So simplicity here is doing a lot of heavy work. And so Occam's razor is actually really and it's really relevant. It's extremely relevant in terms of the design versus evolution debate. And almost all arguments for all the arguments that are posited for evolution, a lot of them have to do with this concept of Occam's razor. And we'll go through this more in detail. First thing to note is that Occam's razor, it's actually not as simple in terms of its definition. There are multiple versions of Occam's razor, right? So in terms of the first version, we're going to be defining it as fewer entities. What this shows is that the the simplest or the explanation that involves the fewest entities is really the simplest explanation. And so the way that evolutionists use this argument, they say something like evolution explains the diversity of life through natural processes, so whether that be mutations or natural selection, without needing any designer or supernatural agent. Now, intelligent design, on the other hand, what these people do is they end up invoking an additional entity, which is an intelligent designer. So therefore, by this kind of reasoning, evolution is a simpler explanation in the sense that it's positing fewer entities and it doesn't posit this extra intelligent entity. And so, therefore, should be preferred. And so, these people would argue that the burden of proof, therefore, would fall on the one who wants to add this extra layer or this extra entity, in this case, the designer, and they have to show why it's a necessary kind of addition, right? And so this argument is common not just in biology, but in multiple kinds of theist versus atheist debates. They often say something like, we don't need God to explain morality. So assuming God in this case is unnecessary, and therefore we can go with a simpler explanation, one that removes God altogether. Now, again, it sounds straightforward, but there are a number of problems with this. So in regards to the evolution debate, what's the problem with invoking Occam's razor, at least this version of Occam's razor? So the problem is that it often overlooks the concept of complexity, right? So evolution, it actually requires a not it requires a vast number of unacknowledged entities or events that have to be true in order for the theory itself to stand, right? So this has to do with things like RNA world hypothesis or things to do, especially if you're, again, if you recall from the beginning of the episode, we're already assuming that we're dichotomizing or we're keeping the debate separate between design and evolution, right? But if you are an evolutionary advocate, assuming you believe in universal common ancestor, a universal common ancestry, which is the tree of life, that everything branches from one particular entity, that in of itself is you're positing that, right? That's a specific complexity that you're positing. Although it seems rudimentary, the way that I've described it before, once you dig deeper into evolution, that there's actually a number of entities that must be invoked, right? Whether that be self-replicating ribosomes, whether that be self-replicate or unique forms of ribosomes in tRNA molecules. And again, we'll get to this much more in detail later on in future episodes. But, and by the way, like I plan on doing close to about 10, 15 episodes on evolution, and each of them would run from 30 minutes to an hour. Just there's going to be a lot of information being presented. But the point again is that the reason why this form of Occam's razor fails is because there's a lot of overlooked complexity and overlooked kind of entities that are being posited by evolution, and because of that kind of disqualifies Occam's razor. And another one of those kind of entities that they're positing are these transitional forms, right? So, according to evolutionary theory, especially the idea of universal common descent, all living organisms are related. So what that means is that if you go back far enough, every major group of animals and plants, they must have transitioned from earlier forms. So for evolution to be true, there must have been countless transitional species and organisms that bridged the gaps between the forms of life that we see today. Now, once we look at the transitional forms, we actually find that they are absent within the fossil record. And we don't really have fossils for many of these transitional kind of species that are claimed within the evolutionary theory. So one of the evolutionary paleontologists, he famously said, the absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed our inability even in our imagination to construct functional intermediates in many cases, has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. So in other words, Evolution as an explanation posits many entities, whether that be RNA, whether that be self-replicating ribosomes, whether that be transitional forms of life. We just don't have any evidence for this, especially direct observable evidence for it. And so they're just assumed to have existed in order to make the theory work. In fact, if anyone even follows the origin of life debate in the back and forth between what's happening on the microbial level, what's known as the soup model, you'd actually see that there's so much difference of opinion on it amongst evolutionary biologists themselves, right? Some of them even invoke the fact that the first known forms of life might have even been extraterrestrial. And so it's not pseudoscience. These are well-known biologists who are talking about this issue, right? So they believe that these self-replicating ribosomes didn't really come from these primordial forms of Earth, essentially, but came from outer space, right? In form of, let's say, asteroids or something. And so that's one of the explanations for how heat was posited, right? Because you need heat as a catalyst for these early forms of life. But again, there's no direct evidence for any of this. These are all postulations that have to be true in order to grant universal common ancestry. So it's not simply the case that just because you're invoking design, that therefore you hold on to more complexity or you hold on to more of these kind of entities. Rather, it's actually the other way around. Often with evolution, you end up seeing that the further back you go, things start breaking down a lot more vastly. And you end up conceding to a lot more kind of entities that you just didn't know existed from earlier on. So that's one of the reasons why this kind of form of justification fails. So this really goes over exactly what I just said. Now, the second version of Occam's razor, it's slightly different than the first one. So the first one had to do with positing fewer entities. This version of Occam's razor, it's basically that the explanation that can account for the most data with the fewest independent explanations is preferred. So in simple words, if one theory can explain a lot of different observations on its own, whereas another theory needs multiple separate explanations, then the one that explains more by itself is considered simpler. So the way that evolutionists use this logic, they say something like natural processes, so whether that be chemistry, physics, or random mutation, or natural selection, genetic drift, bottleneck effect, whatever mechanism they're using, but natural processes can explain a number of things that we observe in biology. And so what I mean by observe in biology are things like adaptations, variations within species, changes in ribosomal DNA, changes in mitochondrial DNA, all these things, right? The fact that natural processes can explain those changes in biology, in that since these processes can explain those features of life, the simplest assumption is that these same processes explain all the features of life without needing to invoke any other cause, which in this case would be something like a designer. Now, if someone suggests a designer or a special creation of a certain kind of aspect needs to exist, then that's an additional explanation layered on top of the natural processes, which again, they would argue violates Occam's razor. So therefore, the claim that there needs to be there is a kind of intelligent designer, that the people who argue that have the burden of proof to show that natural processes alone are not enough. Now, we would see that this rationale is actually very common in the universal common ancestry discourse, right? So those who hold on to universal common descent, they hold on to this notion that common ancestry explains variations within a species or a genus, and the simplest explanation or extrapolation is that all life shares a common ancestor. And introducing separate creation events or independent origins for different groups they would say that would require multiple explanations. And so they would argue that the burden of proof would be on the one who posits those kinds of explanations. Now, this is really important because this is not just to do with design, but this has to even do with other models of evolution. So even if you believe that evolution is happening, even if you believe that evolution is happening without kind of God, even if you believe evolution is happening just through blind forces, but you reject the view that there's only one common ancestor, then this argument even applies there as well. Now, the issue is that again, it's the same issue as before. It really goes or glosses over complexity, right? So just because one process explains something, it's not necessarily the case that it'll explain everything equally in the same amount of detail, right? So sometimes multiple causes are genuinely needed to explain different aspects. And that's because reality often is really complex to begin with, right? So the potential issue with this version of Occam's razor is that really assuming that one known mechanism can simply be stretched to cover all phenomenon, that in of itself is an assumption, and that goes through a number of like scrutiny once you get to actual science, right? So all these things I'm bringing forth, but they're not. I'm not presenting them in detail because this is not meant to explain the science, right? That's going to happen in future episodes. This is really just these are the preliminaries in terms of every kind of scientific theory, these are the things that you have to question, right? And this is very common in universal common descent. This is very common in string theory, quantum theory, whatever kind of scientific explanation you're invoking. These justifications have to exist. And so we'll see in the future episodes, especially the episode when I detail the logic behind universal common descent, where I'll be addressing problems with assuming that just because some common ancestry is observed, then therefore universal common ancestry automatically follows from that. And so data, again, like it might be equally explained by multiple different causes, but labeling it as one kind of cause just because it's simpler, that is very subjective and it breaks down, once we get to the science. Now, the third version of Occam's razor, it's known as the duck test. And essentially, what this is basically saying is that if it looks like X, then it probably is X, right? Or to put it more formally, the way it's often colloquially said, if it looks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then it's probably a duck. So, in terms of evolution, if the evidence looks like evolution happened, then the simplest conclusion is that evolution did in fact happen. And anyone claiming anything else has the burden of proof to explain why it only looks like evolution happened, right? So this reasoning is very similar to intuition. Like when I started the episode, I talked about intuition. This is actually very similar to that, but it's framed as a simplistic argument, right? So the world presents itself in a certain way. Essentially, what this argument is saying is that we should go with that appearance rather than proposing an alternative scenario. This is actually one of the most important arguments for evolution. And we'll see much more of this in future episodes, but evolutionists, they often argue that similarities that are observed among living organisms are exactly what we would expect if they shared common ancestry. And therefore, the conclusion is actually quite straightforward, which is that they did share a common ancestry, right? So if it looks like X, then it is X, or probably is X, right? So if you want to claim that those similarities are due to separate kind of design events, then you're invoking a level of complexity that really doesn't need to be required, right? So that's the logic of using this version of Occam's razor. Again, this is very similar to the intuition thing that we talked about earlier on. Let me just expand a bit more on this, right? Many arguments for universal common ancestry, they start with the observation of homology. And I'll explain what that is later on. But what homology basically, just for simplicity's sake, it means similarity, right? Yeah, so many arguments for universal common ancestry, they start with this observation of similarity across different species. And so similar features, whether that be anatomical or genetic, they're unlikely to exist independently by mere chance. So they must come from a common source. That's the logic here. And to put it another way, similarity implies relatedness. And this was actually stated multiple decades ago. This is actually one of the very first principal axioms mentioned in the science of evolution. And so one of the textbooks, the way that they put it is they say in molecular semantics, the assumption is that degree of overall similarity reflects degrees of relatedness. So again, in other words, the more alike two species are, whether that be in terms of DNA, whether that be in terms of proteins, body plans, then the closer they are presumed to be on the evolutionary tree of life. So, just as a crude example, if we see two species that both have a tail, or two species that both have, let's just say, 5 fingers, then the assumption here is that they must be related, or it's very likely that they're related because it looks that way. And because the alternative is that they just both accidentally got 5 fingers. And that's just very improbable in terms of chance or in terms of probability, right? So it must have been the case that they, or it's more probable that they are related somehow. And again, we'll break this down much more in future episodes, but you can already begin to see that this is really an assumption that's held. There's no actual experiment that's done to prove that the null hypothesis in this case is chance. I don't want to get it too complicated here because I'm already probably losing some audience, but we will break this down step by step in future episodes. Now, to really illustrate this point, if you take the various genes from a bunch of animals and make a family tree based on each gene's similarities, you actually get roughly the same tree every single time. And for example, using a hemoglobin gene versus a collagen gene versus some other kind of gene, the grouping of species comes out very similar every single time. And this is actually a really strong evidence for evolution, right? Richard Dawkins, he famously he says that comparative DNA evidence can be used to decide on the evolutionary assumption which pairs of animals are closer cousins than which others. What turns this into extremely powerful evidence for evolution is that you can construct a tree of genetic resemblances separately for each gene in turn. And the important result is that every gene delivers approximately the same tree of life. Once again, this is exactly what you would expect if you were dealing with a true family tree. It's not what you would expect if a designer had borrowed the best proteins for the job, wherever in the animal kingdom they might be found. So in other words, if a designer had just mixed and matched designs independently, there's no particular reason that the genetic data would neatly form one coherent tree. Now, the observation that genes consistently point to the same evolutionary relationships looks like common ancestry and therefore doesn't look like design. So again, this follows the same thing. It looks like X, therefore probably X, right? This is a very powerful argument for the proof of evolution, and it's often championed by these evolutionists. But again, that's it's flawed for a number of reasons, right? Now, same thing here, really. So Dawkins, he drives this point home and he says that even genes that don't do anything, like vestigial genes or pseudogenes, they also fit the same tree. So he argues that the only way to explain that pattern without evolution would be to say that a designer deliberately made things look as if evolution had happened, right? So in one of the interviews that it's actually publicly available online, Dawkins, he says, you get the same family trees from different genes. You also get the same family tree if you take genes that are no longer functional. This is overwhelmingly strong evidence. The only way you can get out of saying that this proves that evolution is true is by saying that the intelligent designer, God, deliberately set out to lie to us, deliberately set out to deceive us. So again, such statements reinforce the idea that to deny evolution in light of these consistent similarities, you would have to invoke something like kind of God tricking people or God making it look as if evolution is true, even though it's not true. So Occam's razor would say that the less convoluted explanation is the better explanation, right? The argument here, again, it's based off of the duck test or it's based off of appearances as justification. Since everything appears consistent with evolution, the simplest and most kind of reasonable conclusion is that evolution occurred. And so the burden of proof is placed heavily on anyone who wants to claim that it looks that way, but actually isn't. Now, again, notice that this is exactly the same thing as what I started the argument with, or where I started this presentation with, which was intuition, right? The design proponents are actually saying the exact same thing. The design proponents are saying, look, like everything looks designed. So clearly it is designed, right? Or it must be designed. It's based off of intuition. And again, often the counter to that is by saying that, look, just because it looks that way doesn't mean it is that way, right? So there is a bit of inconsistency here where evolutionists are willing to grant this kind of Occam's razor and intuition for their own theory and their own kind of model. But when it comes to design proponents, they're not willing to grant them that same level of charitability or that same level of intuition, right? But yeah, I think that is a good summary, a good wrap up of this segment, which has to do with Occam's razor. And again, we looked at fewer entities, no designer versus one design, simple explanation, one natural mechanism versus multiple natural mechanisms or multiple mechanisms, and the duck test that if it looks like evolution, then that's the simplest explanation. Now, continuing on, the third level of justification when it comes to scientific theories, what's known as blanket possibilities. So, this term refers to a strategy often used in argumentation where one insists that as long as something is possible, we should assume that it is true and we shouldn't rule it out or accept an alternative even if we lack evidence for it. So specifically, blanket possibility means that whenever someone kind of questions, could X have happened naturally, the answer should be yes, it is possible that it happened naturally. And the kind of burden of proof lies on anyone who says, no, I don't think X is possible naturally. So in the context of evolution, if someone says, I don't think random processes could produce this complex feature, the evolutionists would say something like, you can't prove it's impossible, so we'll just assume that it is possible. Now, by invoking this possibility kind of line of thinking, they really don't need to prove that it actually happened. They just have to show that it's possible that it has happened, right? So blanket possibility is kind of like a get out of jail free card in the sense that when it comes to these really tough questions, it makes that case that maybe it could happen, right? It elevates what that really means, right? And it shows that again, it shows that intuition and things like these, it's very inconsistent the way that's being implied. So if a design advocate would say something like, maybe I don't have an argument for this particular piece of evidence, but it's still possible that this something could happen this way, and we can't rule it out, right? An evolutionist would not be happy with that explanation. And so the same thing is seen on the evolutionist side as well, right? So they would say that, look, we can't say it's impossible that like self-replicating RNA molecules don't exist, but it's because we can't say it's impossible, we have to assume that it is at least possible. And the burden of proof is on the person who says that it's not possible, right? And so again, like that goes to show this inconsistent layer that's often being applied. Again, a big issue with using blanket possibilities is that it's often used arbitrarily, especially evolutionary proponents. They invoke it when it helps their arguments, but ignore it when it doesn't, right? So we can consider two claims. The first claim is that it's possible that life and all of its designed looking features could emerge without any intelligent creator. Now, many evolutionists, they would treat this as a given possibility. They assume natural processes could account for everything, even if we don't yet know how. They put the burden of on design proponents to prove that natural processes cannot do that. Now, compare that to a second claim, right? The second claim is that it's possible that an intelligent designer could have had reasons to create a world with suffering and imperfection. Now, the same people who often don't give a generous assumption of possibility, they explicitly reject this version of blanket possibilities, right? And instead, they argue that it's unlikely or impossible that it got the kind of a designer who's supposed to be good or supposed to be maximally perfect would allow things like pain or flaws, etc. And so they treat those kind of design scenarios as implausible by default. And again, that goes to show the inconsistency, where in case, like in the first case, they assume that these unguided processes are possible in the sense that they can give rise to design or what looks like design. But in the second case, they say that it's possibly not true or it's probably not possible for a good designer to create things that allow for pain or seem to be imperfect or the design seems to be imperfect. And so again, this criteria, it really highlights their inconsistency in how they're applying that kind of standard. And this kind of goes over the same thing, talks about the consistency that's being applied. So if we say anything is possible until proven otherwise, then that applies to all sides. Or if we say we need evidence for claims, that should apply to both natural and design explanations. And unbalanced kind of application results in bias towards one viewpoint. I know that these things look somewhat convoluted or they seem like I'm repeating the point, but again, the whole thing here is that if you go and look into the research itself and you see the polemic and you see the debate behind these models, it goes and shows once again that these things are actually happening. There is this level of inconsistency, which is why I decided to start this series because I'm just seeing so much inconsistency on both sides. And like, yeah, hopefully, like this presentation can at least show or delineate that inconsistency before we even go on to the actual science. So, yeah, let's continue. Now, in this segment, we'll be looking at the DNA and we will take a look at the code of life. So this is somewhat of a rudimentary introduction to what these words mean. DNA, it's the hereditary material that's found in like all living organisms, especially the especially those that have this aspect to reproduction, right? So essentially what DNA is, to put it in rudimentary terms, it's like the instruction manual that's passed from parent to offspring, right? So within DNA, you have these segments called genes, and those genes carry specific information. Now, there are two broad types of genes, and those are basically genes that contain instructions for building proteins, and you can think of these like kind of code that directly produce a part of a cell's machinery. Now, we also have another kind of gene, like a separate genus altogether. And these genes, what they do is they regulate or they control other genes, right? They don't make proteins themselves, but they control when and how other genes do make proteins. These are like regulatory codes for an operating system when it comes to managing programs and stuff. Now, according to standard biology, DNA functions similarly to how computer software works, right? It's a coded language essentially. And this is not just me saying it, this is actually a comparison by popular scientists, right? So even like atheists, Richard Dawkins, he says after Watson and Crick, we know that genes themselves, within their minute internal structure, are long strings of pure digital information. What is more, they are truly digital in the full and strong sense of computers. The genetic code is not a binary code as in computers, but a quaternary code with four symbols. The machine code of the genes is uncannily commutable. So again, DNA is essentially code. Proteins coded from genes are the working parts of life. They're called the building blocks of life. And the key question that we'll be focusing on is how such an information-rich computer-like system even arose in the first place. So to get a new form of life, let's say that the first cell or any major new feature, a huge amount of genetic information is required. New code, new instructions have to appear that weren't there before to build a new protein and structure. Now, let's apply our experience of Occam's razor here. So, in our experience, whenever we see a sophisticated information system or coding system, whether that be software or a written language or a coded message, it always we can infer that it comes from an intelligent mind, right? So we have no examples of complex code arising spontaneously without a programmer or designer. So therefore, one can argue that the simplest and most intuitive explanation for origin of DNA's information is an intelligent cause. Now, it fits our kind of experience as well, right? So code comes from a coder. Now, by that logic, the burden of proof would lie on someone who claims that such a code didn't come from intelligence to show how what other alternative way it could have arisen. Now, what is the evolutionary response? So typically they would invoke blanket possibility. They would say something like, maybe it's possible that a code-like system could have emerged from chemistry and physics alone without any mind independent or mind dependent entity, right? Now, they may not know how, but they'll say that it's at least possible and we can't rule it out. Now, more importantly, they can't demonstrate that a process that kind of writes a DNA like code from scratch even exists, right? So there's no experimental evidence or detailed theory that fully explains the origin of genetic code in purely naturalistic terms. But nonetheless, again, the stance is we haven't proven that it's impossible, so we'll assume that it could have happened naturally. Now, again, these have no, first of all, this is very inconsistent, but also these have major implications on the rest of the debate, right? Because number one, if you're positing an ad hoc explanation, right? So if evolutionists are positing this kind of get out of jail free card of an explanation, then that has things to do with regards to parsimony as well, right? And once again, we'll explore this in much more detail later on. But I hope you're getting the picture here. I hope you're seeing where the flaw is, right? That if you're willing to postulate ad hoc explanations like self-replicating ribosomes, like extraterrestrial forms of the RNA world hypothesis, and it's no longer just a primordial soup model. And for those who've studied the origin of life in detail, or the literature on the origin of life detail would acknowledge what I'm saying more carefully. But if you're postulating these ad hoc explanations, then also notice that you're also positing more entities, right? And we'll see like much more inconsistency here and like double standards. But again, like notice how the same people who are content to assume that maybe it happened by chance somehow, they will often insist that believing in intelligence that you did it requires strong evidence or proof. So they're not being consistent with how they're using this method or this modality, right? So they demand rigorous evidence for design advocates, but when it comes to their own models, they'll just throw their hands up and say maybe there is this primordial soup. Maybe there were just the right conditions to exist on Earth. Maybe the atmosphere was just the perfect atmosphere that resulted in this diversity of life. So for the origin of DNA's information, naturalistic evolution gets the benefit of the doubt when it comes to assumed possibilities, whereas design is really treated as an extraordinary claim that must clear a kind of high level of evidentiary bar, right? So again, this reveals the bias in how blanket possibilities are applied. And so essentially what they're saying is that my favorite idea is possible until proven impossible, and that your favorite idea is impossible unless you prove that it is possible. And yeah, we'll highlight a bit more of these inconsistencies. But once again, I'm going over this because this is actually happening right now in mainstream like biology, right? These are not just atheists or a random person on the side of the street who are making these comparisons. These are genuine professors of biology who unfortunately haven't studied philosophy of science. They haven't studied science at all. Sorry, they haven't studied philosophy or logic at all, and they make these comparisons, or they're inconsistent in how they define these things. And unfortunately, what's being taught in school these days, right, and what's being taught in any common undergrad level science book or textbook, it's not going through any of this stuff, really. And so it's presented as if it's a fact, as if universal common ancestry is a fact, but it completely misses these discussions, these inconsistencies. And again, I'm not even saying that you have to be a design advocate. I'm not telling you that these arguments prove that design exists, right? All I'm showing is that there's inconsistencies even on the level of the evolutionists themselves, right? Again, you can completely reject design, but that doesn't mean that you have to accept this concept of universal common ancestry, right? You can believe in multiple independent ancestors in that sense, right? Multiple independent creation events. You don't have to believe in one unique creation event. And again, this is stuff that we'll be going over in much more detail and in a future episode. But yeah, I think for what this presentation's worth, these things are important, and I think this rudimentary explanation should be sufficient. So another inconsistency is in terms of the body plan of an organism or a species, right? So a body plan is like the layout of its kind of fundamental anatomical features. And so animals that share the same basic architecture, they're grouped into a category known as a phylum, right? And so there's a lot of research that goes into kind of phylogeny and creating phylogenetic trees that are based off of these phylums. And essentially, the term phyla itself, it refers to a division in the biological classification system, right? So the phyla constitute the highest or really the widest category of biological classification in the animal kingdom, each kind of exhibiting a unique architecture, organizational blueprint, or a unique structural body plan. Now, the point here is that really like the a phylum is like a basic design of the body's template. So, for example, all insects have the arthropod body plan, which includes stuff like segmented bodies, exoskeletons, joint limbs, whereas all vertebrae kind of share the core data, internal skeletons, spines, etc. And so, differences between phyla are huge. So, for example, jellyfishes versus insects, whereas differences between a phylum, say, for example, cats versus dogs, or for example, chordata for phylums, those are much smaller and they often have the same body plan. Why am I bringing all this up? That's because so the fossil record shows that the major animal body plans, which are the phyla, they appeared relatively suddenly during a period known as the Cambrian explosion. And I'll be going over in a future episode a whole episode on the fossil record, and I'll be spending a lot of time on the Cambrian explosion, what really it is, and how this really shattered a lot of the predictions of the evolutionary model that we have today. But so in a geological kind of short span, dozens of fundamentally new body architectures end up showing up with no clear series of like ancestors really in earlier rock forms, right? Again, I'll be going over this in a lot more detail, but essentially what I'm saying here is that yeah, sorry, what I'm saying here is that there's this aspect of the Cambrian explosion that happens in the history of the world, and we see a sudden abruption of new complex body structures within the fossil records without a kind of ancestor in the rocks, right? And so that's again very unexpected given Darwinian evolution or given common ancestry, right? So each new phyla would have required a lot of genetic information and many uncoordinated mutations to build new organs and structures that didn't exist before. So, for instance, to go from a simple warm ancestor to an insect-like body plan, you need new genes or joint appendages, compound eyes, etc., all organized in a new way. And so a tall order of random mutation and selection, such in a very short time, needs to be posited, right? Now, design proponents often point to this as evidence that unguided evolution struggles to account for life's history. The intuitive inference is that such large leaps in complexity might indicate design, or at least that something other than slow step by step mutations are at work here. Now, it's argued that gradual evolution would produce many intermediate forms, yet we mostly see either the absence of them or very basic forms suddenly giving rise to much more complex ones. How do evolutionists respond to this, right? They respond to it by often invoking blanket possibilities again. So it says something like, it's possible that those intermediate forms existed and we just don't have, just haven't found them yet. Or something like, it's possible that evolutionary leaps can happen through mechanisms, but again, we haven't understood them yet, right? Now, essentially, they maintain that natural evolution could have really done it, and even if current evidence is missing, it still doesn't negate evolution because it still could have happened logically. There will be a whole episode on this where we'll just be going over whether or not universal common ancestor is even testable to begin with, and we will be showing how usually universal common ancestor is coupled with what are known as auxiliary kind of predictions. And what happens is when the predictions fail, what ends up biting the bullet is not universal common ancestry, but it's actually the auxiliary postulations. And those end up biting the bullet and those end up being disqualified, but universal ancestry emerges unharmed, really. And so, yeah, I'll be going over that in detail, but one of the evidences is again the Cambridge explosion that kind of falsifies a lot of the predictions that were made about evolution. So we've gone over this already. Okay, now what we'll be talking about is the fulfillment of specific kind of predictions, right? So this is the fourth justification, and it's very straightforward. So fulfillment of specific predictions. This is the idea that if a theory predicts something in advance and that predictions come true, then it's a strong point in favor of that theory. Now, science works on making hypotheses and predictions, right? So if my theory is correct, I expect X to be observed under Y conditions. Now, finding X in Y conditions is confirming evidence. Now, conversely, if predictions fail, then that can count against a theory. Right? That seems quite intuitive. That seems quite simple. Now, in terms of evolution, both like the whole debate between evolution and design, both sides use this approach to argue for their view, right? It's somewhat different from the more philosophical justifications that we went over before, like intuitions, Occam's razor, and possibility, because in terms of this actually deals with actual testable expectations. This is where actual science is invoked. What we'll look at is how evolutionists claim certain fulfilled predictions as evidence, and how design proponents also claim certain predictions as having been fulfilled. And again, we will consider that sometimes there's this level of inconsistency being applied here as well, right? So let's talk about evolution first. So what are some of the fulfilled predictions, right? The first of which is the transitional fossils. One classic prediction of the theory of evolution, going back to Darwin himself, was that if all organisms evolved from common ancestors, then we should find fossils of intermediate life forms that kind of bridge major gaps. So, for example, between fish and amphibians or between dinosaurs and birds, right? And so over time, a lot of these fossils have been found that kind of link these kinds of species together, right? So one of them is called the tiktaalik, for example, which is it's like a mediary between a fish with it can breathe on land and in water. And so the tiktaalik it has limbs and it's also yeah it has fins as well, right? Or sorry, it has gills as well. This is one of the evidences that proved kind of transitional species, and it fulfills the prediction by evolution, right? We'll be going over this again. All three of these that supposedly fulfill these predictions, we'll be going over them in detail and showing how these are actually failed predictions, or either that or misrepresentation of the actual data. So yeah, just stay tuned for all these, right? But another one is genetic similarities, and that's that evolution kind of predicts a nested hierarchy of genetic relationships, right? And what that means is kind of like a tree of life, essentially. So the discovery of DNA and the mapping of genomes in the 20th and 21st century, that kind of showed that genetic patterns match evolutionary expectations. And so this congruence was predicted by evolution, and it's cited as evidence for the theory that it actually got it right. And lastly, biogeography. So Darwin also predicted that the distribution of species geographically would make sense under evolution. So for example, island species would resemble nearest mainland species, which suggests colonization and evolution of islands, which has been observed repeatedly, right? So marsupials or marsupials mainly in Australia, that makes sense if they evolved there in isolation. And so such patterns were anticipated by evolutionary thinking. Now, these successful predictions really strengthen the claim of evolution in the eyes of those who believe in evolution to begin with. But again, we'll be going over every single one of these pieces of evidence and shining some light into kind of the flaws behind each and every single one of these. Now, just like that, we also have predictions that are fulfilled in terms of design, intelligent design. So the first of which is junk DNA, or sorry, the functionality behind junk DNA, right? So a significant kind of prediction made by many intelligent design advocates was that much of the non-coding DNA, which was once haphazardly labeled as junk, could actually have more important functions. And why did they predict this is because if genomes were designed, it's unlikely that a designer would stuff them with useless sequences, right? So instead, these parts might have purposes that are not yet understood. Now, this was in direct contrast to the explanation of some evolutionary biologists at that time, and they thought that these non-coding DNA segments were practically just like junk, right? They're just leftover information from previous life forms. But really, over the past couple of decades, research has found that there's actually a lot of functions for these non-coding DNA fragments, right? So that includes things like regulatory roles, like structural roles in RNA genes, etc. Now, the ENCODE project, that's one of the biggest projects on this, that's working on this topic. They actually suggest that a large portion of the genome is transcribed or has biochemical activity. And so while scientists debate how much of that is truly functional, the trend has been to uncover more uses for what we thought was once junk. And so again, this was actually predicted much in before by these intelligent design proponents, and they were the ones who were really arguing that it's not actually junk and that there is evidence that shows that they are functional. And so another one is irreducible complexity. So predictions that some cellular systems would be explained or would be hard to explain by stepwise evolution. And they recognized this way earlier on than evolutionists did. And they show that Darwinian evolution is not sufficient to account for design complexity. And what's very interesting right now, currently in development, and this is somewhat off tangent, but we have a modern geneticist. His name is Dennis Noble. And for those who follow the ongoing discussion amongst the people of authority in this field, Dennis Noble is one of the experts, the leading experts in evolution right now. And so he famously said that neo-Darwinism is dead. And neo-Darwinism is basically the new synthesis coupled with Mendelian genetics that shows or that carries on the Darwinian line of thinking of changes in allele frequencies and speciation events through natural selection. And so he famously says that he says the same thing that these ID proponents are saying, right? He's saying that Darwinian accounts of evolution are not sufficient to explain this level of complexity that we see around us. So again, this is something that ID proponents have been saying way before evolutionists have even come to concede on this point. Now, with regards to burden of proof, how do fulfilled predictions really tie into the burden of proof? So generally, fulfilling predictions provides positive evidence for a theory, and that therefore reveals some burden, right? Now, the side with more successful predictions, they're the ones that can say, like, we did what science asks, and so we made a risky prediction and got it. Now, if evolution fulfills a prediction, again, it strengthens the claim that evolution is a robust explanation. And likewise, if design fulfills a prediction, it also suggests that design is a valuable explanatory framework. Now, again, what we end up seeing is that there's a lot of moving of the goalpost, right? In the literature, if one says that I'll believe your theory if it predicts something and it comes true, then when it does happen, we would expect that one should update their views or at least grant that point. But what we actually see is the opposite, right? So in evolution, we see a goal shift, right? Where a lot of the evolutionary biologists who they say that look, universal common ancestry can be tested, and they would say we can test it using this experiment. And when it fails, and we'll be going over a number of these detailed explanations, things that are not even taught in undergrad textbooks, right? But once we go in detail over all of these things, the cope that's often given is that, you know what, like, that's not an issue with universal common ancestry. That's an issue with the auxiliary the auxiliary presuppositions or the auxiliary coupled postulations that we've added onto the theory. And if this seems complicated to you, don't worry about it. It's not really that important right now. But again, we'll be going over this much more in detail later on. Just to conclude, one of the kind of important things to take away from this presentation is that of the burden of proof. So often in these debates, what we see is that intuition and simplicity and assumptions about possibility, these can all kind of shift where the burden of proof lies. And when you're having a discussion on these kind of things, you have to look at where you have to track these kinds of things, right? Are you simply assuming Occam's razor? Are you providing an actual justification for it? Is your opponent invoking blanket possibilities? And if they are you questioning them about it? These things are very important because the burden of proof is really what dictates everything in the discussion. And you will see that in regards to evolution, there is really no proof, or there's very limited proof for a lot of things, for a lot of models, for a lot of theories, right? And a lot of it comes down to how you interpret the data. A lot of it comes down to which one's more intuitive. A lot of it comes down to your auxiliary and your axiomatic presuppositions before you even enter the discussion, right? So things like that, we'll be talking about this in the next episode, actually, but things that have to do with stuff like spontaneous generation, stuff like philosophical naturalism, methodological naturalism, whether or not you're removing supernatural elements from explanations to even begin with. All of these things are important concepts to discuss. And if you can hash out these things before you even get into the science, which is what I'm trying to do in this series at least, if the series is about like 6, 7 episodes long and each of them is going to be about an hour long, I want to spend at least 3 of those 7 episodes just going over the philosophical assumptions in the background. And once we are wary of them, we can finally get to the actual science, the meat and potatoes, because now once you have this good rudimentary base of understanding the complexity of the presuppositions that are happening in these discourses, you can finally understand the actual evidence that they're postulating. And that's just going to be a lot more simple for those who are actually involved in these kinds of courses, in terms of those who are actually wanting to know what the evidence is actually leading one to believe. And yeah, you will be surprised by the end of the series in the sense that you'll start to realize that a lot of the arguments in support for evolution, and particularly in support for universal common ancestry, are actually not scientific evidences at all. They're more philosophical in nature, right? They have to do with probability. They have to do with invoking null hypotheses, right? And we'll go over all of these in detail. Yeah, I think this is a good place to stop, and we'll continue with the next presentation, perhaps sometimes next week.